Welcome back to Chicago Independent Television. Why is there so much protest activity surrounding the 2012 NATO summit? We'll hear now from one activist who offers his take on the issue.
Well, NATO is the world's largest military alliance in history. It is arguably responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. And I would boil down to about 5 reasons why people should oppose NATO. NATO is an alliance that, frankly, beats up on small nations over and over again. We have troops in over 130 countries around the world. Most of the people in the world don't want those troops in their countries. We have a situation where NATO gives the international fig leaf basically to U.S. foreign policy, and that foreign policy is I think, utterly destructive to people in other countries. I mean, Afghanistan, for example, they suffer 450 displacements a day. Afghanistan, 250 kids die of malnutrition each day, and yet we're shoveling $2 billion a week into Afghanistan, which clearly isn't helping the Afghan people. NATO is, again, the fig leaf of international legitimacy for the fact the United States supports all these tin pot dictators around the world. We've got a situation where, of course, the United States complains about the human rights situation in Iran, which is utterly deplorable, but all these complaints, the United States, of course, points to Iran, but shovels billions of dollars in arms to Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian dictatorship. You could point to NATO military spending. I mean, NATO is responsible for 70% of world military spending. The United States is responsible for 50% of world military spending. You contrast that to the urgent needs for funds in this city. We've got a $700 million Board of Education deficit looming. We've got over, I believe, 100,000 homes in foreclosure in this city. We have got a situation where student debt has now surpassed credit card debt, and unlike credit card debt, cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. We've got a situation where our mass transit just a couple of years ago got cut back by more than 10% in this city. You go on and on down the list. There are any number of things that the money could be used for, but instead we're shoveling it to NATO, we're shoveling it to this big military alliance, so-called, which really is a tool for the United States to beat up on third world nations. We have frequently drawn the links to NATO and G8, and I think rightfully so. I mean, the other side did it for us by bringing initially both summits here to this town before axing the G8. NATO is basically the military arm, the de facto military arm of the G8. I mean, when they impose sanctions and those don't work sufficiently good for their purposes, then NATO countries drop bombs. So I could go on and on as to why people need to oppose NATO's policies, but I think it's also important to point out the strategic reasons why we need to oppose NATO. We have got a unique historical opportunity here in Chicago this May to push back against the 1%. The 99% has been taking on the chin for year in years. We've had, of course, the bank bailouts, but this has been a bipartisan policy in terms of against the 99%. But we have an opportunity now to push back because the eyes of the world are going to be on Chicago. President Obama is in the midst of a re-election campaign, and he aims to use the NATO and G8 summits to look presidential before the cameras. By contrast, if we have large and angry demonstrations against the president's pro-war policies, then we can begin to push back on that. I mean, that was the role of Chicago '68. People basically scuttled the career of then Hubert Humphrey, who was the presidential candidate for the Democrats in that year. And our movement at that time moved from the voting booth out into the streets and became much more powerful as a result. And that's my hope for Chicago 2012, is as we move our movement out of the voting booth, which has been an utter disaster for the last 3.5 years, and into the streets. And in that respect, replicate what happened in Chicago '68, because I think an honest look at history will point to Chicago '68 as the true beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. It's when our movement gave up on the politicians of both parties, moved into the streets, and with the anti-war movement within the U.S. military and the efforts of the Vietnamese, finally put an end to that war. And here we have America's longest ever war in Afghanistan going on now, and last year with the greatest number of deaths of Afghans in that war in the entire 10-plus year history. So it's long past time that we put an end to that war too.